Welcome back, listeners. Thank you so much for coming back and tuning in for part 2 of the Salem witch trials. You've made it back to Arts and Crimes, and I'm your host, Kelly.
And I'm your co-host, Brandon.
And I'm your co-host, Josh.
We've made it. That was good. So, today we're going to finish up the Salem witch trials, and I was re-listening to, well, actually, I wasn't really re-listening. I was just doing all the editing for the witch hunter ones. And I feel like I missed an opportunity to talk about Cotton Mathers, because he was a witch hunter that's actually like really prominent in this one. But also, almost more importantly, to talk about Vin Diesel, because he has like a whole witch hunter movie, and it's not great, which is why you're making this face like maybe you've never heard of it.
Yeah. He has a witch hunter movie?
Yes.
He's based on his D&D campaign, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
He has a D&D campaign where he plays a witch hunter, and then he made a movie.
All right. We're like 2 minutes into the podcast. You're already blowing my mind.
I know.
Isn't it called The Last Witch Hunter?
I think it is.
Something like that?
Yeah, something like that. Anyways, I definitely watched it, and I was like, I love this because it's just the kind of terrible movie that I love. Like those kinds of movies where you're like, I don't have the emotional space to feel anything besides like I want snacks and action. And he fulfills that need.
He already fulfilled that need with the Fast and the Furious series.
10 times over.
Yeah.
Yeah, true. I mean, if you're going in a different direction than Fast and Furious, if you're not into cars.
Okay.
But if you're into witches and Vin Diesel.
The Fantasy and Furious.
Yes, there it is.
That was a good one.
So he's the one good guy witch hunter, because I think he actually teams up with a witch, and they go after some bad witches. I'm like, to be honest, I don't really remember it a lot. I'm really sorry, Vin Diesel, because I'm sure he's listening to this podcast. But I think he does like join up with a witch.
I love how this podcast isn't just movie review of Witch Hunter movie now.
Okay, I was just thinking about that for some reason, so I had to start that off. But we'll get back into the meat of why we're here. We'll get back on track. So the Salem witch trials, we talked about the witch hunters and all of the like books that they wrote and published that were super impactful. And
everything from the last one was from the old country, right?
Old 1400s to like 1500s.
We have
times.
not come to the New World yet.
No. And what's interesting is like actually after all of that time, there was a big slowdown of witch trials. So like the 1600s, the early 1600s was marked with a lot of like kind of more enlightened ideas all over the place. But then in this, for whatever reason, the Puritans that came over to America at this time, it was like the 1628 time frame, and they kind of wanted to like revitalize this idea of really strict, pure religion. And they wanted to go back to the like core Bible beliefs that they thought were getting forgotten. And so they came to America, to Massachusetts Bay. They founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they called it their shining city on a hill because they intended to make it this really pure, clean place. They were super religious. And I feel like anytime you get a group of people or individuals that are just like crazy religious, things tend to go real bad, which like sounds terrible, but unfortunately it happens frequently historically. And Cotton Mather he was there during this time, like as a witch hunter, which was like a declining profession. And he wasn't entirely just a witch hunter. He did other stuff too. But he was over in the Americas at this time. And like 3 years before the witch trials happened, he actually published a book that he talks about the execution of a woman named Goody Glover. And in this book, which is also really important, he explains that she was accused by 4 Goodwin children that were claiming that the specter of Goody Glover was like attacking them, and they were having fits, and they were being pinched and bitten and all that kind of stuff. And essentially with that testimony, she was convicted and executed. Even though they really didn't have any evidence. The only real evidence that they had was that Cotton Mather's said that a witch cannot say the Lord's Prayer correctly. And Goody Glover was Irish, and her first language was Gaelic. And so during her trials, she was told she has to say the Lord's Prayer in English. And she couldn't say it perfectly in English because that's not her language. And so they were like, see, she's a witch. She can't say the Lord's Prayer. And those two things actually come up very specifically in the Salem witch trials.
All these tests that they make seem like they just come out of nowhere. Like someone is just sitting there going, I bet witches couldn't say the Lord's Prayer. Like, why?
Yeah.
Why could or couldn't they?
And they don't give any explanation why. Also, you'll find later on that there's so much contradiction. So consistently throughout these witch trials, there's contradiction happening in the court itself, which another guy notes later. So anyways, that was 3 years before the actual witch trials, and Cotton Mather's writes a book and contains that. And then also during this time, because we're in America now, there was frequent attacks, both offensively and defensively, with the Native Americans in that area. And the Puritans saw them as demons under the control of the devil, which reinforced this idea for them that there was demons among us. And the idea that supernatural forces were fighting against their kind of pure religion they were trying to recreate there. And so that already created sort of a lot of turmoil within the people. But additionally, there was a lot of disputes between large families in the Salem, Massachusetts area within the Puritan church, because there was, different views on how strict they should be and who was owning certain land and all that kind of stuff. And so there's land disputes, there's religion disputes, and then there's also, on top of this, a lot of problems with Native Americans and all that kind of stuff. And so right at the beginning of this, there's Reverend Samuel Parris. He was 39 at the time, and he's the reverend of the very conservative kind of faction of the Puritans. And so in January of 1692, so this is during the time that the Salem witch trials happened. They happened during 1692 into 1693. So very, very late 1600s. So his daughter, Betty Parris, who was 9 years old at the time, and then his niece, Abigail Williams, who's a similar age, they began having fits where they would contort and scream, and they said they were being bitten and pinched by invisible agents or invisible specters. Sometimes they couldn't speak, sometimes they couldn't sleep. And Samuel Parris couldn't figure out what was wrong with them, so he called in a doctor. And the doctor came in and he was like, well, I can't figure out what's wrong with them either, so it's witchcraft. Because at the time, that was what doctors prescribed if they couldn't figure out what was wrong with you.
So back then it was witchcraft, and nowadays it's IBS.
Yeah, or in between it was cocaine, whatever. They just sort of fill in whatever. It's just, sometimes it's wild to me that there's so much guesswork in the medical field. But
bodies are complicated. I think it makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it shouldn't be, but it is, absolutely.
I think we've progressed to where we don't generally blame spirits now. But sometimes IBS does feel like that. I was told literally last week that I have IBS because the guy was just like, I don't know, your stomach's weird, man. It's probably IBS.
Maybe you're bewitched.
Yeah.
It's IBS or
if
witchcraft.
It was a couple hundred years ago, that's what he would have said.
Yeah.
Gone, your stomach's weird. It's probably a witch.
Yeah. I would be in trouble then because I'm your opinionated sister, and they didn't like that back in the day. So anyways, the doctor's like, it's witchcraft. And so they're not 100% sure what to do because this goes on for weeks. And so the neighbor suggests a folkloric means of finding witches. And so Paris had a servant that was a Native American woman named Tituba, and she followed those instructions, which was to make a witch cake. And a witch cake essentially is a cake, but it's made with the urine of the victims. And then that advertising.
Clearly.
It started out as a college prank.
And then
I love the idea that maybe the native servant hated them and was busy urinating in a cake that she was going to feed them. And then they come in and they're like, "What are you doing?" And she's like, it's a witch cake. I'm finding witches." And they're like, "All right, well, carry on then."
Makes sense. You're doing the Lord's
Let me
work.
help.
Well, what's great is then you take that cake and you feed it to a dog. And the dog is supposed to be able to find whomever is afflicting the victim because of that, which, makes sense.
I would like to see the chapter and verse in the Bible that recommends the witch cake dog method
Of finding witches.
witch hunting.
Well, I don't think that one is actually in the Bible because Paris actually gets real mad about them doing this. And also it didn't work. So I don't know if he was mad because it didn't work or because it's like not biblical. So what ends up happening is they decide they have to figure out who's behind this. And what's crazy is when you look back at why they started the fits, like historians look back at the fits and they try to find explanations. And so one theory was that during that time, there was different types of like famine and storage issues with food. And there was a theory that rye that had gone bad, a byproduct of that is called ergot. And ergot is either used in or part of the making of LSD. And so what they surmised, potentially, was that they had, bad rye that had gone bad, and then they were eating it, and they were having hallucinations. And so that's where the fits were coming from. But the problem with that is that none of the symptoms actually match anybody that is on LSD. Because they would, be totally fine, and then suddenly have a fit, and then be totally fine again. And that doesn't match any of the, symptoms you would have from either, ergot poisoning or LSD or anything like that. And so then they tried to see if there was some sort of, mental thing going on. And they talked about really kind of the fact is that kids during that time were not allowed to be kids. So there was, especially in these Puritan communities at the time, they were expected to be reading their Bible or doing their chores. They had to be an asset, idle hands are the devil's playthings kind of thing. And so what they surmise is it was just too much for the child's psyche to handle. Because when they looked back at previous cases where children going through these sorts of fits and accusing people of witchcraft, they all have very similar fits. They all have very similar responses. And then it's taken care of in very similar ways. Once they have kind of attention and they are in the limelight for a while, then it somehow dies away fairly quickly. But when they look over everything, other than that, they really just cannot surmise anything that other than the girls were just faking it the entire time, which is just wild because so much happens from all of this. Literal deaths happen from this faking it. But also when you think about it, because at the time, if you falsely accused someone of being a witch, then you yourself could be hanged as a witch. Basically, if you accuse somebody of being a witch and they weren't, then it really meant that you were the witch. And they would,
he who smelt it dealt it.
Yeah.
Method of witch hunting.
And they took it to the nth degree, and they could be hanged. And so I imagine there was also some amount of pressure for Paris to prove that the girls were really being tormented by a witch because it's his daughter and his niece. And so Paris takes it upon himself to essentially torture Tituba. So a lot of the information I get was from, there's like books that actually have the records that they still have from the trials. And so some of it is conjecture based on like other testimonies that they can find and things said here and there. So what they say is it's most likely that Paris tortured her, but there's no like actual documentation of it. But they take Tituba in because the girls finally say that Tituba is the one that's doing it to them.
So Tituba is the one who made the witch cake?
Yeah.
And she's also the witch?
Yeah, that's what they're saying.
That's why it didn't work.
Yeah.
If she had made it right.
Sabotaged it.
Yeah. And really, it's just, especially at the very beginning, it's a lot of people going after low-hanging fruit, essentially, because Tituba was not of the Wabanaki tribe, that is the tribe that they're currently warring in, the Native American tribe, but she looked a lot like them because she was a Native American. And so everybody kind of was very prejudiced against her anyways. And so they took her in to be like examined. And the way that these witch trials are done, I think this is something that like I was confused on for a long time. So reading this kind of explained it. So the way it's done is in separate ways where they have these examinations and these interrogations first. And that essentially establishes that we can try these people later for being witches. And even though they're not being tried, they don't have a court date, they still are sitting in jail waiting to go to their trial. And so a lot of these like witches are sort of rounded up at the beginning, and they have these examinations where they're like, you know, they strip them down and find devil's marks. They do different tests like, you know, the dunking we talked about, stuff like that, and different forms of torture to get them to confess. And so you'll see, like in the readings, I often found that people were in jail for a really long time, but didn't actually go to trial for months and months and months. And many women actually died just waiting to get to their trial because the conditions were so poor. So they take Tituba in for her examination, and there's actual court documentation of it, and I read it, and it is wild. Because they take her in and they start asking her, like, why are you tormenting these children? And she says, I'm not tormenting them. And they're like, look at them, they're tortured. Why are you doing this? And so she almost immediately just starts confessing. And she says that she's harming the children because she was told that she had to harm them or worse would happen to her. And she started doing that because the girls were flipping out while she was saying that she was innocent. And so then she says that she saw the devil, and they asked how he appeared. And she said sometimes he appeared as a hog, or sometimes a tall man with dark hair and black clothes, and he had a yellow bird. And other times he would appear as a big black dog. And the girls were allowed in the room of the examination. And so they would like, you know, freak out when Tituba talked. And then during this time when she's like saying what the devil looked like, appeared to her, they would repeat in unison what Tituba said as if they were in a trance. So it was like a wild show that was put on. And most of the town was at this because it wasn't some official thing where they were like, only official people in here. And so the town saw this and sort of started growing crazy. And then Tituba admitted that she signed the devil's book. And when she signed the book, she saw other witches' names from the town. And so she specifically named Goody, or her name is Sarah Osborne, and then Sarah Good. So Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good. And then another woman that she didn't know, a tall man, and she named a few more. So by the end, she said that there was 9 witches that were in this village somewhere that she saw in the book. And so on February 29th, They actually put Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne all in jail. And I think, again, the Sarahs were sort of just easy, low-hanging fruit, essentially. Because Sarah Good was a beggar and had a bad temper. And so she would go around begging at people's houses. And then if they didn't give her stuff, she would like mumble things and tell them that they'll regret not giving her stuff. And I think one time she like cursed somebody's cattle. And so that was actually used against her as evidence that she was a witch, that she would like mumble about stuff when she left. And then Sarah Osborne was just known for supposedly having loose morals. So those two were sort of, again, kind of low-hanging fruit, easy women to accuse. And Sarah Osborne actually never did get a trial because she died in the prison before she could ever get tried.
So is there any conjecture on why Tituba called these people out?
So the only thing that they can guess is because she was tortured. So the other thing that I read was very frequently they told the women if they confessed and if they named other witches, then they wouldn't hang. So a lot of especially the early people that were accused would confess and then name other people because it was kind of their only way to make sure that they didn't hang. And very consistently, only the people that refused to give other names and refused to confess were the ones that were hanged. And which is like interesting because a lot of them, so like after the Sarahs were accused, they also accused Martha Corey, and she was like 60 years old, and she was a fixture in the church. Like she was a good member, she was always there, and she refused to ever confess or name other people. And part of the reason why she refused to confess and name other people is because she said lying was a mortal sin and she wasn't going to commit a mortal sin. But they were like, well, you're a witch, and so you're already committing sin, so you have to tell these things. But no matter what they did to her, she refused. She refused to confess or name other people.
So they took this beggar woman's testimony and hung a prominent member of the church?
So Martha Corey was actually accused by other children. Okay. So the beggar woman was accused by the children and Tituba, and that's why she was hung. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a huge amount of the people making these accusations were actually like young children, teenagers, and like lots of women just sort of started joining in, which is the same kind of thing we were talking about. We're like, why did you join in? Like with
the first TikTok trend, like the first viral thing where kids are like, we're trying this new thing, everybody's doing it. It's called getting people you don't like murdered by the church.
Yeah, and like the thing is when they look over the documents, it's clear that there was an absolute direction that these were going. And so after these first ones, you can kind of see there's a real big prominent name, the Putnam name. And so they sort of like are behind a huge amount of these. So they're like the ones making the TikToks viral in this. Because so Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, who is the servant of the Putnams, they're the ones that accused Martha Corey. And then Martha, like while she's being accused, those girls are freaking out in the court anytime Martha like said that she wasn't guilty. And the girls would like flip out and scream, and Martha, like the court, because I read the transcripts of this one too, because they have this one as well. And Martha's like, I didn't do anything. And he's like, look at these girls, they're freaking out. Of course you did stuff. And so he just is like repeating these accusations over and over again. And every time she like wrings her hands, or like at one point she bit her lip, and the girls like start screaming like their lip hurts, and like just crazy stuff that's allowed in the room.
Here's what I don't understand, because going back to the TikTok example, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's all these TikTok trends. What was one? Devious licks.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah, I hated it.
Remember that one?
Yeah, I heard about it.
Yeah, stealing stuff or whatever.
I had my clock stolen from my classroom.
Yeah. Kids do dumb things all the time. For those of Kelly's students that are listening, we're not talking about you. We're talking about other kids. But the adults typically don't go, that's a great idea. We should go along with it. Like, I understand how a put upon child who's powerless in the 1600s might do this for attention and to get back at somebody they don't like or just to feel powerful, right? I don't understand why an adult would listen to them.
No, it makes no sense to me.
Well, like, supernatural things were much more accepted, right? I mean, like, it wasn't that the kid was spouting complete nonsense, but the kid was spouting stuff that matched up with beliefs of the time, right? Like, it's not completely in left field. It's out there, but if the parent believes in a witch, would it be so hard to believe that your kid is not crazy? And maybe you don't want to believe that your kid is acting out or crazy. Maybe you want to believe that there is something else that's causing all this. I don't know. Like, I'm not trying to excuse by any means. These people are idiots.
No, but that's a really good point. Like, you would rather believe that your kid isn't acting out because that reflects on you as a parent, right? And if you're like, well, my kids are angels because I'm the perfect parent. So, like, if the choice is between admitting that maybe you raised a little monster or this person that nobody likes is doing something bad, I think that you sort of agree with already. I think that's an easy choice for a parent to make sometimes.
Well, and I think also, as devious as this is going to sound, I think also there was a lot of opportunity for them to get gain in the way they wanted by utilizing that.
So that's kind of what I'm sitting here, like, waiting for that to develop. Because as you've been talking about this, I haven't yet seen the point. Like, when we talked about all of the witch trials in Europe, it seemed like a very common theme was we're doing this to either get control and get power or retain power. And that's what a lot of those accusers, it seemed like they were just trying to be in control. Where I haven't yet seen like a common theme of why these are going. I assume we're probably going to see that.
So I'll just cut right to it, because I mean, really, the next thing on my list is pretty close to that. So
Excellent segue.
excellent segue.
Excellent segue. Excellent pun too. You're on top of your game tonight.
This is why I keep you two around. So what they would do is they would actually jail these people, and something the sheriff at the time was George Corwin, and he would illegally seize all of the assets of women that were imprisoned, and he would keep them for himself very frequently. So, George Corwin, his father, Jonathan Corwin, was one of the magistrates in charge of these examinations. And so he was letting this all fly. And they would find people that had land or, assets that they wanted, and, things would magically go their way in court, and he would be able to maintain those assets. And nobody bat an eye, because they had to go somewhere and they couldn't be belong to a witch. Additionally, when you imprisoned a witch, really it was kind of when you imprisoned anyone, because at the time the Puritans really weren't fans of violence. So instead they just took everybody to court. And so there was it was very common to take things to court and to take people to jail. But if somebody was jailed, then you had to pay your own, essentially, room and board while you were in jail. And that went straight to the funds of the sheriff and the judges and all that kind of stuff. And witches were kept in the worst part of the jail. So it was like below ground. It was always kind of wet and cold and dank. And if you wanted new straw for bedding, you had to pay for it. If you wanted a stool to sit on, you had to pay for it. If you wanted any food or water, you had to pay for it. And so all of that money that they were getting from all of these imprisoned, because it's hundreds of people that are imprisoned by the end of this, and they're basically just like racking in the money every time somebody goes to jail. And the Putnams, as I said, was like a huge proponent of this because they owned a lot of land and they also had a lot of stock in the very conservative half of the church. So in Salem, in this area, there were two kind of factions. There was sort of the conservative, and then there was this more lax version of the Puritan church that they didn't want to be so strict and they didn't want to be so harsh on people. But the Putnams had kind of all their money and all their land invested in this more conservative version. And he was a big supporter of Samuel Parris. And he actually wrote a huge percentage of the accusation papers that we still have of the witch trials. He also, of the accusations that were written, Thomas Putnam, his wife, his daughter, and his servant are behind, just them individually, are behind 181 of the accusations. And then his brother, Edward Putnam, is behind 13. And then his brother-in-law is behind an additional 7. And then a bunch of those are in Putnam's writing, and he just put their names to it. And like in the documents, the person that wrote it was like, presumably with their permission, but it's his handwriting and he wrote their names. So it could very well just have been him and he's using somebody else's name, you know? Also, he was recording and fashioning a good amount of the evidence that was presented at court cases. And when he wrote, so to take somebody to get this examination, you had to write the evidences as to what they did to be able to be accused as a witch. And he would, write down the accusation, which was very loose, and then they'd torture them. And in the examination, he'd add to the paperwork later what they got from them after being tortured and like in this room where these victims were acting out and freaking out. And so then he'd be like, oh, but she also like signed the book and saw a man in black clothes. And he like added that later because they brought in like more modern times, they brought in handwriting specialists to look at all that. And it was like verified that it was his handwriting, but sometimes it was a different color ink. It was a different quill because the way the writing was different. So it wasn't like that he just ran out of ink and used a different thing. It was completely different. So they know that it was done at a different time from the initial accusations that he would write. And then kind of the last thing about him was that he had almost a 100% success rate in whoever he accused, what either went to jail or was executed. And that's like an unheard of percentage. Mm-hmm. And so he would also, receive benefits of like land and money and kind of revenge because he had a grudge against Reverend George Burroughs. So before any of the witch trials happened, this Reverend, he was a Harvard graduate, but he was very lax in his like religious beliefs as far as what Putnam thought was okay. And the villagers at the time, they weren't paying his salary. That was a way that villagers sort of protested against their reverend, is they like wouldn't pay their reverend, like whatever that's called, alms, religious donations. I don't know, tithes maybe. Anyways, that was his salary, is whatever the congregation gave. And so they just like withheld that. And George Burroughs had borrowed money from the Putnams, and so he couldn't pay it back because he wasn't getting paid. And so the Putnams took him to court, and the judge ruled in Burroughs' favor because he was like, you're inciting the people to not pay him, And so he can't pay you back because he's not getting paid. And eventually Burroughs did pay the debt, but Putnam was reported to be very embarrassed and very angry that he hadn't won the case. And so then Ann Putnam accuses Burroughs and said that his specter told her that Burroughs was the leader of the witches, that he killed 2 of his wives because he'd been married 3 times, and that he killed the wives and daughters of his predecessors, and that he had bewitched the Native Americans in their fights against the Puritans so that they would be victorious. And they were like, no way, he's so bad. And then, so then Cotton Mather's kind of had his eye on Burroughs, and they sent him to jail, which, again, these jails were super overrun. And by this point, nobody had actually gone to trial yet because they didn't actually have that authority. They could only examine these people and decide if they were like, you know, if it was a good enough case to be tried for a witch, as a witch. And so after all of this, so May 27th, they created a special court in order to convene. It was called the Oyer and Terminer. Yeah, Oyer and Terminer, to deal with all of these because the Salem jail was not meant to house this many people. And so they started this special court, and the judges were like merchants and just like regular guys that had no experience with this kind of stuff. And the other things is that they instated in this, which is one of many of the things that the Salem witch trials did wrong, because for these people that they had locked in jail, they never gave them bonds so that they couldn't like get out at all. So there was no bonds. It made it easier to accuse other witches because it wasn't costing anybody anything. And so then when the trials actually began, the witches had to defend themselves. They were not allowed to have an attorney. So they were there defending themselves. All of the accusers were allowed to participate in the trials, and including any kind of evidence that they produced. So like all of that spectral evidence where they're like, these accusers were like, I can see that he has a big black dog next to him, and they're the only ones that can see it. And the judge is like, yep, there it is. That's proof enough for me. They also did this test called the touch test. This is wild. Just so crazy. What it was if the person that accused the witch started flipping out, then they would have the witch come and touch the person that was flipping out. And if they stopped freaking out, they were like, see, that confirms it. You're the one that's doing it to them. And they used that as evidence against people.
Again, highly scientific.
Like, man, I mean, couldn't an argument be made that this person is so holy, their touch is driving away
I mean, I feel like that's in the Bible.
Man, it's mind-boggling.
That's the thing is like, I feel like that's such an obvious defense, but they weren't allowed to have attorneys. So most of these people, I mean, Burroughs was an educated man, but you're talking about like Sarah that was a beggar and had no job and no education, and most women weren't allowed to like be educated. And so it's essentially all these really uneducated women and a few men, and they weren't allowed to have anybody defending them.
Okay. I'm not a historian, so I have no idea. Like nowadays, everyone has right to legal counsel.
Mm-hmm.
When was that instituted? Was that after this, or was it before this and they just are denying all these people that right?
I think it was before this, and I think they were just denying them the right, if I understand correctly.
Well, I mean, this was before the founding of the United States, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was
So the Bill of
1692.
Rights wasn't a thing yet.
Okay, yeah, that's
So,
fair.
Like,
Yeah.
we'd have to look
Not
at
historian.
We'd
You'd have to look at like
English
European.
processes.
Yeah. But they haven't followed any of the established European processes.
Yeah.
So my guess is the European processes included some sort of defense. Though I didn't look it up. It's a super good question. I didn't look it up. Somebody should Google that while I'm talking. So now that they've kind of commenced these actual trials, they went through and sifted through who they had in jail, and they picked who they thought would be the easiest to convict. And so they picked Bridget Bishop. She was not one of the initial ones that were selected. She was a 50-year-old, and a couple of the things that made her just sort of like prime to be this first executed was that she'd already been accused of witchcraft 12 years previously. And additionally, there was a witness, his name was John Lauder, and he claimed a few years before that she had appeared as a specter in the night on top of him in his bedroom, and he had no power to resist her. So, and he, like, that was taken as evidence that her specter was there doing that. Which, again, like, they believed that the specter was actually the devil in the form of these people, because they believed that the devil couldn't take a form, and so making a pact with the devil, the witches allowed the devil to use their form to go and do these bad things.
Interesting.
So that was kind of the idea behind the specter. So yeah, and then during the trial, people like in the audience that were there started screaming that they had pins in their hands that were from her. And so it's recorded that they actually had like pins, like needles stuck in their hands. And so historians are looking at that and they go, either somebody else put pins in them that's sitting next to them, or they put pins in their hands themselves and then flipped out and was like, she put pins in my hands. And the judges and everybody was like, see, more proof. She's such a witch. So yeah, they did that, and that was allowed, and they would accept that as evidence. And so she was convicted. She was the first person found guilty on June 2nd. And she was the first one to be issued a death sentence. And then on June 10th, she was actually hung. And so after she was hung, one of the judges in protest actually resigned, but he didn't actually do anything. But he did. I mean, there was some people, even in the early time of these trials, that did feel like they needed to, renounce these behaviors and activities. But it did not slow anything down. So July 19th, 5 more were executed. And that included Rebecca Nurse and Sarah Good. So that's when they were executed. And they were like, okay, so all of these are terrible. But the Rebecca Nurse one is particularly interesting and terrible because not only was she like such an important, like she was a revered member of society. So like tons of people signed petitions that she was a great person, that she would never do that. Ultimately, it didn't matter. But originally, she was found innocent. And when she was found innocent, a bunch of people in the audience flipped out and started screaming and started having fits until the jury was like, okay, fine, she's guilty. And then she was found guilty and executed. Which is like, she was found innocent. And they just changed their mind because everybody threw a tantrum.
Peer pressure.
Peer pressure at its worst. You're just making a face again,
Yeah.
like,
Well,
Rose.
it's just wild.
Yeah.
What a great lesson to teach their children.
Yeah. So then they brought in George Burroughs for his trial, and a bunch of people testified against him. And a bunch of them was like Ann Putnam, and there was people that wrote stuff against him that had been in jail that were accused and confessed witches. A bunch of people attended the trial. He was sort of like a controversial guy because he was like, when he was interviewed, they were like, when was the last time you took the sacrament? And he was kind of nonchalant about it, where he said that he didn't attend all that often and he couldn't remember the last time that he took the sacrament. And so people already kind of found him a little bit sacrilegious anyways.
This was a reverend?
Yeah. He was a reverend, and educated, but he never actually had an official parish. So like he was never officially put in charge of a congregation.
So he had the title of reverend, like because of what he studied.
But he never
But
actually...
he wasn't
Yeah.
somebody's pastor or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
That's funny.
Probably partially because of that attitude.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think Puritans were interested in that time frame.
He's more popular now, probably.
But yeah, I'm sure he'd be very popular now. I mean, he seems like a cool guy.
He was ahead of his time.
Yeah. Which people in the olden days, they didn't like that.
Yeah, you ahead of your time? Must be a witch.
Yeah.
Exactly. So he not, and during his trial, this is when you were like, oh no, foolish man. Because he not only claimed his innocence, but he claimed that witches weren't real and that specters didn't exist.
Oh no.
Yeah.
That's just what the devil would say.
And yeah, they didn't take kindly to that. So he was found guilty. On August 19th, that was his scheduled day to be hanged. Spoiler alert, he does actually get hanged. So yeah, sorry. I say but, and I was like, maybe there's a spark of hope in your heart, but don't get it there. So he was scheduled to be hanged, and Cotton Mathers was so interested in making sure that he was like hanged and found guilty. Like he traveled to make sure he was there at his actual hanging. And before, they had him up on the ladder with the noose around his neck. Cause the way that they did it is they called it turning off the ladder. So they would have him stand on a ladder and then they would just turn them till they were flipped off of the ladder. And so he was there standing on the ladder with a noose around his neck, and he said the Lord's Prayer flawlessly.
Oh, snap in your face.
Yeah, you would think. So much so that like the crowd started surging forward and they were like, you have to let him go because he said it perfectly. And Cotton Mathers is the one that wrote that a witch cannot say the Lord's Prayer perfectly. Mm-hmm. And so they're like surging forward. They want to release him. They want to get him down. And this probably must have been so like great and terrible all in one moment for Burroughs because the crowd is surging forward to get him released. And Cotton Mathers calms them all down and then tells them that the devil is really good at mimicking angels, and that happens in the Bible. And that's what he's done, is all he's done is mimic angels, and that he's guilty, and he convinces the crowd to hang him. So
That seems like it goes against his earlier statement.
it's just another one of those moments where you see just glaring contradictions. I love your face. I'm sorry. Just like so disappointed in humans.
It is disappointing. And these people find themselves in positions of power, where they could do so much good, and I guess they just find it easier to do terrible, terrible things.
Mm-hmm. With great power comes great responsibility. What is that one?
Right.
With
I
great...
think that's Spider-Man.
Yeah. No, I was thinking at the Key and Peele where he's like, with great power comes great responsibility. But they don't use that responsibility, or they don't use that power for good, obviously. Which my history teacher, Mr. Miglioretto.
Mr. Mig.
Mr. Mig. Wait, did you have him?
I don't remember that name.
Yeah, he was great. He was one of my favorite teachers. And I remember him saying, and this is a very common phrase, so it didn't come from him, but I just learned it from him, that it's power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think this is, just that living example of this.
I disagree a little bit. I think that certain people are attracted to power that are already corrupt, basically, right? Mm-hmm. Like, think about the Reverend, right? Mm-hmm. Burroughs.
Yeah.
Who was probably a decent guy. And because of that, he didn't try to be a leader in the community. He was just content to kind of live his life, right? Like, if you're a decent person who's happy with yourself and your place in the world, you're not going to be like, I need power over other people's lives. You're just going to be like, I'm happy with who I am and they can do their things and I'll do mine. But if you are a person who has an unhealthy preoccupation with others and with their stature in comparison to ours, to your own, then you'll probably find yourself drawn to positions that allow you to put other people in their place, basically, right?
So maybe it's something more of like corruption seeks power and absolute corruption seeks absolute power.
How about the more power you get, the more comfortable you are being yourself and like letting your actual personality show through, perhaps? It's like people who are corrupt and are seeking power, when they don't have power, they're kind and they're doing whatever it takes to win over people. And then as they get that power, they can relax and they can start to exert that power that they've been hungry for.
Yeah.
And like let it out.
So it's like a revealing agent.
Mm-hmm. Maybe.
It's an art term. Revealing agent.
Yeah, it is. That's where that comes from. I can't help
Arts
it.
and crime.
The duality man. What a
Yeah.
juxtaposition.
Yeah, like lemon juice. Is that a? What'd you say? A revealing agent. You know, when you got
Oh, like lemon juice in
you
the
put it on the secret, invisible
in
words. put it in the
Declaration of
oven.
Independence.
Yeah. Thank
What
you,
is that movie?
Nicolas Cage.
There it is. It doesn't matter. It's Nicolas Cage.
Returning to our real thing as a movie review podcast.
So yeah, Cotton Mather's absolute hypocrite. Power, whatever his jam is, he's not a good guy. At least I don't think so. So yeah, he gets hung, and then what that does is, like in my brain, like I remember like when I was first researching this and reading about this, I was like, oh, this will be the turning point where people go, this is bad. We shouldn't be doing it anymore. But instead, what it does is people double down. And this next month, this month of September and into October, is the bloodiest, worst month of the witch trials, where they have the most accusations. They have 9 more executions, and oftentimes they were like encouraging families to accuse members of their family. And very commonly, it was children accusing their own mothers for whatever reason.
Because kids are terrible.
Throwing a tantrum.
Yeah. And like they were all taken seriously, which is, again, like adults are taking these crazy accusations seriously.
It feels kind of like the sunk cost fallacy, right? Like they've gone this far.
They gotta keep
killed
going.
some guy that said the Lord's Prayer. Like, now we got to double down. This is who we are. Because if they admit maybe that was a mistake, then they just killed an innocent man.
Yeah.
So instead, what they're going is, we heard that the devil can pretend to be an angel, so now it could be anyone.
Yeah, it was kind of no holds barred. They
Yeah.
could go after anybody. And so one person they accused was Giles Corey, which was a guy that was, I mean, it was a man. So that, again, a second man. And there's actually more than these two. There's a few that they accuse, which is another like symptom of how bad these trials were that like, you know, prominent members of the society and men were included in this craze. But he was the husband to Martha Corey, who was accused and convicted earlier, but she hasn't been hung yet. And so at this point, because all of this kind of has been happening and they're all aware of what's going on, he refuses to play the game. So he refuses to confess. He refuses to name anybody else. He refuses to enter a plea of any kind. And so they are like torturing him. They're demanding that he enter a plea. And there's a little caveat: if you don't plea guilty, and if you don't confess, then they can't confiscate your land because you're not an accused or like confessed witch. So not very many people refused to confess, but those people legally, they couldn't take their land because they weren't a confessed or convicted witch. So Giles Corey, he refuses, and I think he's one of the more famous of the victims because what he does is actually pretty hardcore. So he's
like 60 something though, right?
Yeah,
he's hardcore 60.
Like this guy is the coolest grandpa, because so he in an effort to get him to submit a plea and confess, they take him out into the yard and they put a plank on him and they start stacking rocks on top of him. And for the next 2 days, they just continue to stack more rocks, slowly crushing him. And so they're like, will you confess now? Will you confess now? And he's not saying anything. They keep putting rocks on. They keep putting rocks on. And towards the end of the second day, like, the amount of weight is immense. And they lean down and ask him if he'll finally confess. And he says, more weight. And that's all he says. and then he passes away. So he, like, to the last moment refuses to give in. And there's a legend that says that the sheriffs, because of this action, are cursed by, like, I'm not 100% sure if it's the Corys or just because of this action. But the sheriff Corwin, I'm blanking his name right now. He actually dies from, like, a heart issue. And interestingly, every sheriff in that position dies young from a heart issue for, like, decades. Whoever holds that position. It's like the, defense against the dark arts class. It's like you can't, you get in it and you're not going to make it.
Was it a family position though?
I don't think it was. Which would explain it.
Right. If it was a
genetic thing, but I don't think it was. And so
it was a curse, Brandon.
Yeah,
okay.
come on.
Remember?
I'm sorry.
We're talking about witches, not science.
Yeah. I said science, not a seance.
So they say there's a curse, but obviously they can't prove it, but it is kind of interesting that, defense against the dark arts happen there. So anyways, that happens. And then they're like, okay, we'll go to Martha Corey now. So they kill her husband that way. And then they bring Martha Corey in. And they're like, okay, now you need to confess. And so she refuses to confess. And she refuses to name any other witches. And so a couple days later, they just sort of give up and they hang her. And so this is when things...
They gave up on the rock thing.
Yeah, just that one guy.
Really poorly with a grandpa. We're not doing the rocks again.
Yeah, we don't want to have that happen again.
That was all the citizenry saw us stacking rocks on a 65-year-old man.
Yeah.
And they were like, maybe they're not the good people they put themselves out to be.
Yeah, are we the bad guys?
Yeah, are we the baddies?
Yeah.
They don't design our uniforms.
Yeah, so, and really that's when people started like, maybe this is all no good. And so then there became a growing number of people that sort of joined this refusal to play the game. So they wouldn't confess and they wouldn't confuse or confess. They wouldn't confuse. Sorry. They wouldn't confess and they wouldn't accuse other people. And so there was a big downturn of how many people they were getting to confess and accuse. And then a guy named Thomas Brattle, he starts openly speaking out against the court cases and the judges specifically. And in his writing, he talks about how the judges will find contradictions and flat lies being told by the accusers, but then the judges will vindicate them by saying the devil took their memory, and that's why there's that discrepancy. So it's just like blatant that they're making it up so that they can get what they want. Essentially is what he's saying. And so then people that had confessed to being witches, they started also, like, so these are people in jail that had confessed to being a witch and accused other people. They also started having second thoughts and wanted to start recanting their accusations. And there was one girl, 17-year-old Margaret Jacobs. So she had confessed to being a witch and accused not only George Burroughs. So she was part of the group that had accused George Burroughs. But she'd also accused her own grandfather, George Jacobs. And then the day after her grandfather was executed, she dictated a letter to the judges, recanting everything she had said, and explained that both her grandfather and George Burroughs were innocent, and that she had only confessed and accused because she had been told if she did that she would live. Otherwise, they were going to hang her. And she's, like a 17-year-old. So it makes sense. And it goes to say that that's what they were saying to everybody,
Yeah. Like a drowning person will pull someone else down with them, trying to save themselves. I mean, this is not unheard of behavior.
Yeah. It's kind of established human behavior. And they were absolutely taking advantage of that. And so then at this point, Cotton Mather's own father, Increase Mathers, he issued a warning to the area that it would be better that 100 witches be spared than one innocent person die. And at that point, the deaths came to a halt. And so then there was all of the remaining people left in jail were eventually released. There were 3 more people convicted, but the governor gave them reprieve, and they were also set free. One of the judges was super pissed about it, and he threw a fit, but nobody did anything about it. They let everybody else free. And within 3 months of this kind of ending moment with Cotton Mather's father, Increase Mathers, all the rest of the 49 witches that they had in jail were released. And there was also an additional 3, sadly, that passed away in the jail before they could really be released. They were waiting. But otherwise, the rest were done. And it's really hard to say exactly how many people were affected, how many people were jailed, how many people were actually executed, because a huge number of the documents were destroyed. So we do have some court records, some transcripts. We have there's only 2 surviving death certificates or death warrants, essentially, of any of the people that were executed, because they went through and they destroyed a lot of documents. I think largely because it was entirely embarrassing what happened, and a lot of it was not actually legal. So that ended in 1693. So by 1703, the general courts, they kind of finished throwing out the rest of the evidence that was used in trials. So a lot of evidence went missing. A lot of it was spectral evidence, so it wasn't even real evidence anyways. And then in 1607, Anne Putnam, who was now 24, she made a formal apology to the church and to families that had had people executed because of her testimony. And in her apology, she did not state that she was lying or that it was false, but that it was, trickery of the devil that made her accuse in the way that she did, essentially is what she said. And then in
I don't know if I buy her apology completely.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like unless you take accountability for your actions fully, you're not really apologizing. So, I feel like there was probably a lot of guilt, but I think it was real hard to face that kind of thing.
Great YouTube apology.
Yeah.
Hey guys, it's me again. Some of you have heard about my recent testimonies that may have led to the execution of dozens of people. And I just want to say, I never thought it would go that far. It was a harmless prank, and I feel really bad that those
like and
people
subscribe.
died. Yeah.
I mean, and I imagine that there was probably a lot of people that just had a lot of guilt to live with after that. Children that had been pivotal components of people's execution. I can't imagine. But in 1711, the colony begins to pay monetary compensation to some of the accused families. Although Sheriff Corwin never returned any of the property that he illegally confiscated, by the way. He refused to return any
shocked.
Yeah. In 1957, the state legislature issued an apology for Ann Putiter and others who were executed. So not everybody, but a few, which is bizarre to me that it wasn't in 1957. They weren't including everybody. They were still holding out to a few, I guess. But by 2001, there was a legislature passed that absolved all of the remaining victims of guilt. And then Massachusetts has worked to create memorials and museums kind of erected in the honor of the victims. And there has been concerted effort to try and find where those victims were buried, because if you were, convicted of witchcraft, then you didn't get to have a marked burial because you weren't allowed to, I guess. So a lot of the remains of victims were unaccounted for. So there has been some effort to try and find those recently as well. But that's sort of, there's so much information. I think this is sort of a good overview of the whole thing, but there is just so much more. But what is interesting to me, I found as I was doing, I watched so many documentaries and read so many books, that it's so pervasive, the information that we have, even though so much of it was destroyed because I think they wanted it to be swept under the rug and we wouldn't let it. But it's because it is such an affecting story, and it is like one of the last kind of witch hunts that happened historically, because after that there's really not any, because it's right at the cusp of this enlightenment where science was deemed not evil and of the devil.
I have some thoughts about that we can talk about when you're done.
No, go ahead.
So here's what's interesting is that we were talking about they just make up these tests, right? Mm-hmm. And it reminded me of I don't know if you've ever read Aristotle or Plato or right? When they're talking about natural laws. So Aristotle talking about gravity is there's these four things. There's air, earth, whatever, fire, and water. And they prefer to return to their natural locations, right? And that was his thing. He's like, that's why rocks fall, because they belong with the other rocks. And that's why air floats and blah, 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 right? Mm-hmm. And he just sat down in a chair and just thought it out and then said, and that's how it is. That's science. That's the world, right? Okay, and that's what people did for the vast majority of recorded history. Mm-hmm. And in the Western world, what's funny is in the East or in the Orient, there was more of what we might consider the scientific method earlier. In the Western world, it really started around 1620 with Francis Bacon. So the scientific method that we kind of take for granted today, right? That is, you have a hypothesis, and then you have an experiment, and then you prove or disprove it, right?
I learned about that in school.
Wow.
Stay in school, kids.
I'm I have to
make a plug for
a plug for schools. Get educated.
So at that time, they were in a transition period between you need evidence for stuff and you just think it up, and if you say it convincingly enough, people believe you, right? Mm-hmm. And so all of these witch hunters could just say oh yeah, the urine cake methodology or the thing. I thought about it and it's true, and because I'm a charismatic person, you're gonna believe me. Mm-hmm. And then there was this gradual shift that went to, well, now you need evidence, physical evidence, and the scientific method is a thing and people expect that, and mm-hmm. that went from the scientific community and also kind of permeated the law, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting to see this transition and how this was kind of that last dying gasp of that attitude of I just think of it and it's whatever I want it to be, Yeah.
I really like how you said that, because it does feel like it was this kind of last dying gasp and they really were holding on to it. Because I was researching a bunch of Shakespeare and Greek mythology and that kind of stuff that are older than 1690 something. They had witches in their stuff. The Greeks had the Fates, but they're essentially the witches. And in Macbeth, there's the three witches. But I don't think the Fates are bad guys in Greek mythology, are they? They just sort of are the fate.
Yeah, I think they're
neither good nor bad.
Yeah, exactly. They sort of just exist, right? Neutral. And so I think as it got to this point where we started seeing witches as these kind of evil, terrible things. It sort of was reflected in media, and we start seeing witches as like these old ugly hags that are going to like curse you, and they have toads and they have warts on their nose and that kind of stuff. And then the further we get, like from 1690 whatever in the 1700s to closer to modern time, we see the witches, the portrayal of the witches in media, and even its existence in people's lifestyles as much more mainstream, much more accepted, and seen in a positive light. Like there's the Wiccan lifestyle. I don't know if it's a religion or if it's a lifestyle. I apologize. And like I would
leave a comment below if you're a Wiccan. Is it a lifestyle or a religion?
Or religion, or is it both? Maybe.
Is it both?
I don't know. But like also the idea of almost astrology feels a little bit like witchy. Like if women in the Salem times had been like, the stars help me know what I need to do, they'd be like, and you need to go to jail. But also in like media, because I feel like you remember that show Bewitched, where she's like this really pretty witch, and we kind of get more and more of that as we get more and more. They're like so popular and so cool to be now.
Do you think Bewitched is what led the Massachusetts? Because that was like, it was black and white, right? So it was probably in the 50s. And then they were like, witches aren't so bad. Let's pass that legislation and say some of them were all right.
Oh, yeah, because it was in the 50s. It was 1957.
Yeah.
Some guy was like,
he was watching Bewitched.
she's all right.
Some of them are kind of cute.
Maybe. And you know what?
And they do that thing with their nose.
They say like art imitates life, or life imitates art. You know, there's a back and forth there. So maybe.
Yeah.
There's a few films in particular that came to mind, and one I really liked that I know you've seen, Josh, is Paranorman.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that one like really narrows in on the Salem witch trials.
Yeah.
And that idea of like, because there's going to be spoilers. So
Have you seen Paranorman?
I don't remember if I have or not.
It's so great.
It's a really good one. I always watch that at Halloween.
Yeah.
And like the main witch that they're like trying to stop through the film, at the end, she like skip forward if you haven't seen it, or like whatever, because you should watch it. But like towards the end, you realize that she's like an 11-year-old girl or something. Although in the film she does have actual supernatural powers to be able to talk to the dead, and the judges were like scared of her, and that's why they killed her.
The third film review in this episode.
Yeah.
But
what I think I liked about that is that they sort of are picking one aspect and highlighting it in that film. And that idea is that somebody was different and they didn't like that. And so they had to get rid of it. And I think that is a very common theme in like the witchcraft or the witch trials throughout, like during the witch hunting times and this one. You know, she was like women with loose morals, quote unquote, and like outspoken women, and, you know, men that like Burroughs that said that the witches weren't real and that specters weren't real, and all of these things that were very opposed to what they were doing. And they were very opposed to this idea of science and change. And so they wanted to do whatever they could to kill that idea from taking over and causing change, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. I don't know. It was a crazy time. But I think I wonder, like, it's probably hard to see all the far-reaching effects of this time, right? Like, Josh, you were talking about the scientific method taking hold at this time. And I wonder, like, how much of what happened there helped to drive that desire for us to be more science-based and more physical evidence-based in our court system and just in general. I asked the question earlier about legal counsel, right, being a right. And I didn't do an exhaustive search, but the only thing I could find was that in the United States, lawyers and that idea of legal counsel really took off in the 1700s. And I wonder if this happening right there at the end of the 1600s and how awful it was maybe helped drive the importance of having lawyers and legal counsel and proper procedures.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. In aviation, for a while I worked as a dispatcher, and in aviation, there's a term that I heard a lot where they said there was regulations and rules that were written in blood, because it wasn't until something went real wrong and a bunch of people died that they figured out they needed to create a regulation or something to fix that issue. And it feels a little bit like that, right? Like, this is something that was written in blood that helped the next, generation or the next group of people look at that and say, we can't do that again. Let's have something put in place to stop that from happening. Which I think is, it's sad, but at the same time, I appreciate that as human beings, we're like, we need some fail safes to help protect innocent people.
So can I make a request?
Yeah.
Can you look back in your notes and tell me the name of the person who stood up and said that there were inconsistencies in the judges?
His name was Thomas Brattle.
Okay. Well, I just want to call out Thomas Brattle because for me, like hearing all this story, he's really maybe the hero of the story for me, because the way that you presented it, this was a turning point where he called out the judges. And last podcast, talking about the European witch hunters, the best way to get yourself killed was to call into question the people doing things. So
yeah,
when you started talking about what he was doing, I was like, this guy's dead. So,
he doesn't die.
He doesn't die.
He lives.
So thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, good job, Thomas. And I think that's a beautiful thing to appreciate, because it was a big risk to do that. Because it wasn't just, right before this, Burroughs is hung, and he had just spoke out about witches, in his own trial. But historically, like you said, they would be killed for speaking out. So it is a brave thing to do. And I also think it's really beautiful, the strength of these people towards the end, that after Giles Corey refused to confess and then his wife refused to confess and accuse other people, that they were willing to give their lives to, reaffirm that this is outrageous and this is not right and we're not playing your game anymore. And, how long could these people go killing innocent people and keeping that up? And it's just it is a really sad tale, but it's also sort of beautiful in a way, to the strength of humanity as well. It has both of it has that dichotomy in it.
The duality of man.
The duality of man.
No, I had a thought about that, because when you think about it, it is not a particularly satisfying story, because we see, hold on, how do I put this? The story can lead you to be pessimistic, because you see the way that people abuse power or the legal system or take advantage of other people, and at least all these deaths, right? And then it can be optimistic, because you see if the people that are under the heel, as it were, that are being prosecuted can band together, they can turn things around. And that's really, really a good message. And that's what we see over and over again in history, right? Like when you look at slavery and apartheid and the civil rights movement, and gay rights and all of these actions where there was a group that was oppressed, and then when they worked together they were able to overcome. But what's dissatisfying is that in those stories the bad guys also are just fine. Like the sheriff didn't give the land back, right? And in apartheid, for example, right, much of the wealth still remained with those people, the white minority that had oppressed South Africans, right? So it's funny that real life, yes, it's inspiring, but it's also kind of depressing because there's no resolution, there's no happy and then everyone got what they wanted. It's like these people suffered for no reason for several years, and through their own force of will, they were able to get out of it. But it wasn't like a triumphant moment. They had to stumble out sick and poor, now destitute, and return to their families potentially disgraced, right?
Yeah.
And it just kind of the world carried on, and it was a better place in the long run, but not for them right then. Right?
Yeah. Which maybe that's part of why it's important to continue to tell these stories, and to tell, how it really happened, so that, because I feel like as humans, we forget so easily, and history is so cyclical. We keep doing the same thing over and over again. But it's so much easier to do it over and over again if we're not constantly being reminded of this. And so it is a little bit ugly, but it is also so important to always remember those things, so that hopefully we spend less time with the bad guys, and we save more lives, and we're able to have more justice done quicker, and have those fail safes for the innocent and for the minorities built in quicker for them. We hope we improve as we continue to hear these stories and be reminded of these stories as time goes on. We spend less years doing witch trials, because it's hundreds of years of doing witch trials. And so hopefully the next time we see something happening in history, we can trim that time down, and we can do better, and we can be better. But we also have to not forget both the beautiful and the ugly parts, like you said.
And I'm not sure that it was or is a dissatisfying story, depending on your perspective. It certainly is not a Hollywood ending to a story where the bad guy gets his just desserts and everybody lives happily ever after. But for those people who went home, it was probably great. And those people who abused the situation and took advantage, maybe they didn't get an immediate smackdown and they lost everything or whatever, but they lived with what they did, and their legacy is ruined.
Yeah.
Their name is not looked at with any kind of honor or respect. I think life rarely has a Hollywood ending, but I would be so overjoyed to have someone come home to me from that jail.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I love what you said about, the kind of legacy of those people, because those women and men that were tried and executed are revered now, as strong, and they are viewed and accepted as innocent and are honored. And we have them honored through our media. We have them honored in so many different paintings and representations of them.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that there doesn't necessarily need to be a happy ending for the story, because I'm going to sound cliche here, but the story of humanity has not ended. It's still going. And what happened there, and the fact that story still exists, it means that we're building on it. And there's nothing that we can do to make that time better. There's no reparations for what happened in the past. But we can take it and build on it and try and make sure that something like that never happens again.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I think that's an excellent point and an excellent place to kind of pause, because I like ending on a high note there. So thank you guys for going through this two-parter with me. I know that there was a lot of ups and downs, but I do love these kinds of stories because of those reasons. And I like the idea that we're a chapter in the story of humanity. And I hope that the chapter that we leave, is a positive one. And I appreciate what we've learned and what we've gained from the chapter that was left by those people too. So anyways, thanks for stopping by at Arts and Crimes, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Okay, bye.
Listen, this episode had a lot less weenus jokes in it, and I think we need to redo it, okay? We need to bring back the weenus jokes.
Take it from the top.
Yeah.